The cold sun bore down like judgment itself, stark against the empty blue sky, as Isadora Burns stood barefoot in the center of a rough-hewn circle of dust and stones. Her wrists were bound in front of her with a length of leather cord, cracked and old, as though chosen for symbolism rather than strength. Every breath she drew was thick with a taste of dust and fear. Around her, her husband's kin, 3 generations of them, stood motionless, their eyes hard, their fists clenched around stones plucked from the nearby arroyo. No one spoke. Even the children, perched behind mothers and uncles, were silent. Isadora's lips were cracked. Her mouth bled slightly from where a cousin had struck her that morning. Her dress, once blue calico, was now the color of churned earth, ragged at the seams and torn along the hem where she had stumbled on the way to this makeshift place of execution. She did not cry. Not anymore. Not after days of being locked in the barn, fed scraps, kept from her infant son, whose cries still echoed in her skull like the lingering notes of a hymn. Turned bitter, a crow cawed overhead. No one moved. Elijah Byrne, her father-in-law, stepped forward, a tall man, leather-skinned and righteous. His voice had once commanded respect across the prairie. Now it only carried fear. He looked down at Isadora with the wariness of a man, delivering what he believed to be divine justice. She made her bed in sin, he said to the gathered family, not to her. She brought poison to my son. She invited darkness into our home, and now she faces the consequence under God's eye. She opened her mouth to speak, to shout the truth that had burned in her throat for weeks, but all that came out was a raspy whisper. He was sick. He was sick, long before a sharp slap cracked across her face. Martha, her sister-in-law, breathing hard from fury and righteousness, stepped back and raised a stone. You don't get to speak anymore. You lost that right when you murdered my brother. Isadora sagged forward, stunned but not broken. They didn't want the truth. They wanted a scapegoat. She had married into their clan 4 years ago. Outsider with olive skin, a tongue that spoke Spanish in her sleep, and a softness they mistook for weakness. Her mother had warned her before the wedding. The prairie don't love women like you. It swallows them whole. Still, she had loved Thomas Byrne. He had smiled at her like she was made of light. But the man she'd wed had grown darker each year, bitterness blooming in his bones like sickness. When the fever came along with the shaking, the foaming, the madness, they turned their eyes on her. Called her cursed, said the Mexican blood in her summoned devils. She'd begged them for mercy. Not for her own sake, but for her baby David, not even a year old. She had tried to flee once, 2 days ago. They caught her before she reached the edge of the woods. She bore the bruises still. A boy, Jonas, Elijah's youngest nephew, stood trembling beside his father. His stone slipped from his grip. Elijah's gaze snapped toward him again. He said. The boy picked up the stone, teeth clenched, tears filling his eyes. He had once laughed on her knee. She had sewn him mittens last winter. A low whistle on the wind twisted through the trees, sudden and strange. A few heads turned. Then came the thunder. HOOFBEATS. First one, then many. The sound rolled over the plains like a storm, fast, hard, chaotic. Eyes widened. Some dropped their stones. Elijah raised a hand to shield his eyes from the sun as the riders emerged from the cedar breaks beyond the ridge. 5 horses, painted in mud and blood. 5 men with long braids, lean muscles, and the fierce, regal bearing of ghosts risen from the dust. Their faces bore war paint, black lines under eyes, red streaks across cheekbones. The lead rider carried a rifle slung across his back and a tomahawk loose in one hand. Someone screamed. A woman grabbed a child and ran. Elijah reached for the pistol at his hip, fumbling. Before he could draw, a shot cracked the air. Dust exploded near his feet. A warning. The Comanche warriors did not hesitate. One of them, Tao, scarred across his jaw, rode straight into the circle. His horse reared, whinnying, hooves flailing in the air. Martha fell backward with a cry. Isadora did not move, could not move. She was a statue of bone and breath. The scarred warrior dismounted in one fluid motion. His eyes locked onto hers. No rage, no pity, just a sharp, assessing calm. Without a word, he pulled a knife from his belt and sliced the leather cord binding her wrists. The others provided cover, shouting in a tongue the settlers couldn't understand. Firing into the air, scattering the mob, a younger cousin tried to grab Isadora's arm. The warrior leveled him with the back of his hand. Blood sprayed from the boy's mouth. You want her? Elijah roared. Take her. She's cursed. She poisoned you too. The warrior said nothing. He lifted Isadora onto the horse like she weighed nothing at all, swung up behind her, and kicked the animal into a gallop. Gunshots echoed behind them. One bullet clipped a tree. Another whizzed past her ear. She didn't scream. She didn't even look back. The forest swallowed them whole. Branches tore at her skin. The wind howled past her ears. Her body trembled, not from cold, but from a flood of adrenaline, confusion, and the sudden absence of pain. She couldn't tell how far they rode, only that time blurred. The sky darkened, and her vision dimmed. When she awoke, it was night. The stars overhead were cold and unfamiliar. She lay beside a fire, wrapped in a buffalo skin. Her head throbbed. Her wrists were raw. The scent of smoke and leather filled her nose. Across the fire, the scarred warrior sat sharpening a blade. The firelight danced on his face. casting shadows that made him look both ancient and ageless. He glanced at her but didn't speak. Isadora sat up slowly. Her hands were free. She expected chains. She found none. She tried to speak. Her voice was hoarse. Why? He didn't answer. Instead, he held up a water skin. She took it, drank dot around her. The other 4 warriors lounged in silence, tending to horses, cooking strips of meat, murmuring in low voices. They didn't look at her. They didn't touch her. She watched the scarred one, the leader. Something in his eyes reminded her of the plains, wide, dangerous, impossible to read. Isadora, she said at last, pointing to herself. Isadora, he blinked, then pointed to his chest. Tosawi, she nodded. A name, a start. Days passed. They moved like smoke, never staying in one place more than a night. She was not bound, but she did not run. Where would she go? She didn't know how to survive out here. And strangely, she didn't feel like a prisoner. They gave her food. They gave her a horse. One of them, a younger warrior with bright eyes, showed her how to use a sling to carry stones. Another sharpened her broken knife. Still, no one spoke much. It was not a silence of cruelty, it was the silence of a world where words were too costly. Tosawi watched her often, but without hunger or threat. He was always the first to rise, last to sleep. His hands bore scars from battles she couldn't imagine. He was younger than Elijah, but older than her husband had ever felt. At night she dreamed of David. Her baby's cries haunted her, twisted through trees, carried on the wind. She didn't know where he was, if he was still alive. The thought of him in Martha's arms made her blood run hot. Tosawi noticed her tears once, but said nothing. He simply tossed another log on the fire and handed her a strip of dried meat. Then came the riders. She saw them first, dust on the horizon. Not Comanche settlers. She froze. The warriors tensed. Tosawi said something in a low voice. 3 of the men scattered into the trees. One stayed beside her, a knife in his teeth, bow in hand. As the riders drew close, she recognized one of them, Gideon Byrne, her brother-in-law, a man who had once asked her to dance, who had grown colder after Thomas died. He looked meaner now, sunken, beard wild. He scanned the trees. Isadora, he shouted. You with them savages now. You think that baby's yours anymore? Her knees buckled. The Comanche didn't move. Not yet. Watching, waiting. I'll give you one chance, Gideon barked. Come out, face what you done, or I burn every patch of forest till I find your bones. Isadora looked at Tosawi. He didn't blink. I can't go back, she whispered. You don't have to, he said. It was the first time he spoke to her in English. The words were quiet, measured, but they settled into her chest, like an iron brand. She reached for the knife. The moment passed. The settlers rode on, perhaps thinking she was already dead. The warriors didn't follow. Not yet. That night she sat beside the fire and stared at her hands. They were no longer soft. They were calloused, bruised, alive. I will fight, she said softly. Tosawi nodded once. That was all. The stars wheeled overhead. The fire burned low. She no longer belonged to the burns. She no longer belonged to a past, but she was not lost. Not anymore. The morning after the settlers passed without incident, the forest exhaled a long, uneasy breath. Isadora rose stiffly from her bed of pine needles and dirt, rubbing her wrists. The healing leather burns itched. The previous night's fear still clung to her skin, a cold sweat not yet shaken off. But the silence unbroken by gunfire, untouched by screams, told her she had survived again. She looked at Tosawi crouched nearby, sharpening the edge of his tomahawk. He didn't acknowledge her, but she sensed he had been awake for hours, or perhaps he hadn't slept at all. Their small group moved without ceremony. Fire was buried beneath packed dirt, every trace of their presence scrubbed clean as they resumed their path westward, deeper into Comanche. No questions were asked. No strategies shared. Isadora followed on horseback, flanked by the youngest warrior, a lithe, sharp-eyed man who occasionally glanced at her as if measuring how long she'd last. She hadn't yet earned a name from him. The rest didn't speak much either. Communication passed through gesture, glance, the occasional grunt or nod. She was an anomaly in their world, tolerated but still untrusted. On the 3rd day, she tried to help when the horses needed watering. She stepped forward, hands up, signaling peace. One of the warriors hissed something sharp in Comanche, and she halted. Tosawi raised a hand and murmured a command. The younger man stepped back. Isadora crouched, filled a wooden bowl from the stream, and held it out to the nearest horse. It drank without fear. The others watched. She returned to her spot without looking at them, but she felt it. Something shifted. The ice hadn't cracked, but it had creaked. At night, the forest sang its songs of distance, and hunger wolves howled far off. Owls called to each other from unseen perches. Isadora curled herself into the buffalo hide she'd been given. Its scent was earthy, musky. It didn't smell like home, but she'd stopped longing for that. Home, after all, had tried to kill her in dreams. She saw David, his small milk-stained mouth, the way he'd clutched her finger with his entire hand. Sometimes he was alone in the dream. Sometimes Martha held him, whispering poison into his ears. She'd wake in the middle of the night with her heart thudding like hooves against hard ground. The forest changed as they traveled. Hills gave way. 2 flatlands peppered with scrub, then dense thickets where trails twisted like secrets. Isadora started to recognize patterns, how Tosawi always took the highest ground, how the warriors moved like animals who knew they were not at the top of the food chain. She copied their habits, how to kneel low when drinking, how to tie the bedroll tight, how to listen for more than she saw. Gradually, someone handed her a walking stick sharpened to a point, then came a sling and smooth stones. One night, the quiet warrior they called Escher, hawk-nosed and slow to blink, showed her how to loop the sling over her fingers. He didn't speak, he didn't smile, but when she managed to strike a pinnacone off a low branch, he gave her a single nod. She felt it like a medal pressed into her chest. The rain arrived, without warning. A southern squall tore through the woods like a whip. Trees groaned under the wind. Rain battered the camp. The fire hissed into nothing. Isadora scrambled to gather the saddlebags before the creek turned to a river. Her boots stuck in the rising mud. Then her foot slipped. She went under. The water was frigid. Swift panic clawed at her throat. She tried to scream but swallowed the flood. Darkness surged around her, rocks slashing at her sides and then hands. Strong fingers yanked her from the current. She was dragged onto a boulder, coughing, shaking, gasping. Tosawi loomed above her, soaked but calm, his face unreadable. He removed his cloak and placed it over her. Then he returned to the others. That night they found shelter beneath an overhanging cliff, barely deep enough for cover. The storm continued into morning. She didn't sleep. She listened to the breathing around her. 5 men, hardened by a life she was only beginning to glimpse, all now connected to her by a chain of events none had planned. She sat beside the fireless pit and traced patterns in the dirt with her finger. When dawn finally broke, Tosawi crouched beside her and said, "You were not meant to die." His English was rough but clear. It was the first sentence he had spoken to her since the night he had named her alive. She looked up, water still, dripping from her hair, and said, "And yet, I keep coming close." A silence passed between them that was not empty. Over the next days, something in the group's posture changed. No one said it, but she was no longer a burden. One of the men handed her a length of jerky without being asked. Another let her ride closer to the center of the group instead of trailing behind. One evening she caught Tosawi watching her as she prepared a fire. She met his gaze. "Steady now." He said nothing, but he stayed beside her until the flames took. She began speaking more softly, mostly to herself, sometimes to Tosawi. She told him about her mother, about the weaving, about the river near San Antonio where she used to swim. He never replied, but he never left either. The moment she truly became one of them came with the mountain cat. They had stopped for the evening near a clearing ringed with heavy trees. The horses were tethered, the fire was burning low. Isadora had wandered to gather more kindling when she saw it. A flicker of movement in the tall grass. Yellow eyes, muscle and sinew, coiled, and watching she froze. The cat inched forward. Her hand found her knife. The sling was useless at this range. Her breath caught, and then a whistle. From the woods, a soft tisk-tisk she'd come to recognize as Tosawi's call. She shifted her weight slowly, praying the cat wouldn't pounce. Then a thwip, a single arrow. The cat shrieked, stumbled, and fell. Tosawi appeared behind her moments later. She dropped to her knees, shaking, heart galloping. He didn't offer comfort. He simply placed a hand on her shoulder, steady and warm. She reached up and held it there. The next morning, Escher carved the cat's claws into pendants. One was handed to her. She wore it on a strip of hide around her neck. A symbol, a warning. The mood shifted after that. The group traveled with more urgency. They passed burned-out wagons on the trail, bones picked clean. One of the warriors said something sharply, gesturing to a boot with the heel torn off. Isadora couldn't understand, but she knew. Settlers close, possibly the burns. Tosawi called a halt. They moved into a rocky canyon where the wind howled like warnings. That night they sat in a tight circle. Tosawi pointed at the horizon. "They come," he said. Soon Isadora wrapped the hide tighter around her shoulders. "If they find us." He looked at her then, truly looked. "You still want to run?" She didn't answer right away. "I ran before," she said. "I begged them, I tried to explain. They didn't care. They needed someone to hate. It's easier than grief." He seemed to understand. "You have hate now?" he asked. She thought of David, of the look on Elijah's face when the first stone was raised. "I have purpose," she said. "If I go back, it won't be to explain. It will be to finish something." Tosawi nodded once, then handed her a musket. It was older than any she had handled before, heavy, unfamiliar, but it felt right in her arms. They spent the next 2 days preparing. Traps were set, pits hidden beneath brush, deadfalls and spike traps fashioned from sharpened branches. Isadora watched and mimicked, her hands blistering from the work. Escher showed her how to smear mud across her face to kill scent and reduce shine. She slept little, she dreamed less. On the 3rd morning, scouts spotted dust on the horizon. 10 riders, all white men. Armed, Isadora recognized 2 faces. One was Gideon. The other was the preacher who had turned away at her sentencing. The camp emptied, horses were moved. The fire was smothered. Isadora took her position behind a boulder, musket braced. Her hands trembled. Tosawi crouched beside her. He placed a hand on her arm. "No fear," he said. She nodded, lips tight. They waited. She could hear them hooves striking dry earth, the creak of saddle leather, voices calling out, "This is the end of the line." Gideon shouted, "We know you're here." The wind answered with silence. Then the first trap snapped shut, a scream. A horse reared and fell. Chaos. Tosawi gave the signal. Arrows flew. Isadora fired once, missed, reloaded with shaking hands, fired again. This time the bullet found flesh. Gideon turned toward the shot, spotted her whore. He screamed, rage twisting his face. She didn't flinch. He charged Tosawi. We moved to intercept, but she stepped forward first. Musket raised, she waited until Gideon was close enough to see the whites of her eyes. Then she fired. The sound shattered the stillness. Gideon dropped. Dust swirled. Gunfire dwindled. The rest fled. When it was over, Isadora stood unmoving, the musket hot in her grip. Tosawi approached. "You fought." She turned to him, face unreadable. He would have taken everything. "You kept something," he said. She looked past the canyon, toward the distant plains. "No, I reclaimed it." That night, they buried one of their own Kuma. The youngest. Silent vigil was held. No one wept. Isadora placed a sprig of cedar on his grave. She sat beside Tosawi by the fire, the claws still around her neck, the musket beside her. "I will find my son," she said. He didn't argue. "You will need help." Her eyes met his. "Will you come?" He didn't smile, but his voice was low and steady. "I already have." The canyon lay silent at dawn, the air thick with dust and the memory of battle. Isadora stood at the edge of the rocky ledge, musket in hand, her gaze fixed on the distant plume of smoke where her pursuers had fled. Every nerve in her body hummed with anticipation. Beside her, Tosawi knelt, inspecting his tomahawk's blade, every motion deliberate. He did not look at her, but she felt his presence like a tether to steadiness. Below them, the bodies of the fallen lay strewn among shattered branches and torn leather straps. The youngest Comanche, Kuma, had breathed his last here, his life sacrificed so that hers might continue. Isadora closed her eyes for a heartbeat, bowing her head in silent gratitude. She turned to the narrow path that wound down into the canyon floor, where Gideon Burns' body lay half buried in dirt. She approached it with measured steps, her boots echoing against stone. His face was contorted in terror, a final expression she would carry with her forever. She knelt by his side, resting a gentle hand on his chest. He would never harm another woman. He would never harm her son. She whispered the words she had no chance to speak before. Forgiveness and defiance braided together on her tongue. Then she rose, her heart pounding not with relief, but with the fierce certainty that this fight was far from over. They moved swiftly, Comanche and stranger alike, gathering what supplies remained: ammunition, dried meat, water skins cracked but serviceable. Isadora refilled her sling's pouch with smooth stones. She strapped Kuma's bone pendant around her neck, feeling its weight like a promise. She adjusted her stance, testing the musket's balance. Each motion was practiced, precise. The wilderness around them pulsed with potential threats. Rattlesnakes coiled beneath sun-warmed rocks. Hawks wheeling overhead, eyes sharp for movement below. This land was as much predator as protector, and she had learned its rules in the past. Days tread lightly, watch constantly, trust sparingly as they climbed from the canyon. The Comanche rider spread out in a loose formation, creating a moving fortress around her. Isadora found herself next to Tosawi, matching his pace. She noticed the way he watched the horizon, how his hand hovered near the butt of his rifle. His silence spoke volumes: caution, respect, shared purpose. She dared a glance at him. His profile was chiseled against the sky, stoic and inscrutable. She thought of her son, his tiny fists, his bright eyes, and the ache that bloomed in her chest like wildfire. She spoke his name softly, letting it carry on the wind. They paused at a creek where the water ran clear over polished stones. Isadora knelt at the bank and splashed her face, the cold biting through layers of grime and steel. She cupped her hands and drank deeply, tasting the promise of life. Behind her, Tosawi offered her the water skin. She accepted it, nodding in gratitude. For a fleeting moment, she saw him not as captor or rescuer, but as the only constant in a world that had turned to chaos. She wanted to ask him questions about his people, his past, his dreams, but the unspoken bond between them kept her. Silent words she had learned were precious and rare. They rode on, the landscape transitioning into open plains dotted with yucca and scrub oak. The sky stretched endlessly above, an expanse both liberating and terrifying. Isadora rode with her back straight, shoulders squared, every sound the clip of a rifle snap, the brush of reeds against leather set her heart racing. She felt the weight of every eye on her, the vigilance of the warriors surrounding her. It was as if she had become the heart of their company, her survival theirs to protect. She realized then that she had changed. The frightened woman bound in the barn was gone, replaced by someone tempered by fear and forged by loss. Late that afternoon, they came upon a ravaged homestead, a smoking ruin where charred beams still smoldered. The Comanche halted their horses at the edge of the burnt clearing. Isadora dismounted, moving forward to inspect the ruins. She recognized the layout. It was one of the strained farms she had passed weeks before. Now it lay in ashes, walls collapsed, Personal belongings, scattered and broken. A child's doll, half buried in ash, lay face up, its glassed eyes missing. She knelt to pick it up, turning it in her hands. The doll's hollow dress reminded her of her own loss. She felt Tosawi's shadow fall across her, and heard his quiet question, "They come this way." She stood and returned to the group. The sun dipped low, shadows lengthened. Tosawi pointed westward, where the black line of trees marked the border of Comanche. Beyond it lay settlements, hostile lands, but also the possibility of her son's rescue. She inhaled, her lungs filling with the pungent scent of smoke and earth. The decision to cross that boundary meant certain death for some, painful choices for all. She met his eyes. "We go tonight," she said, her voice unwavering. He inclined his head, and the others readied themselves. They rode into the twilight, each step deliberate. The living sky glowed in bruised purples and reds as the canyons opened into rolling hills. Isadora felt the weight of every choice press upon her, the life she was willing to risk, the line she had to cross between vengeance and survival. She gripped the musket tightly, the wood smooth and familiar against her calloused hands. Ahead, she sensed her past gathering like a storm, her in-laws, the settlers' rage, the preacher's cold eyes. She would face them on her own terms, not as a victim but as a force to be reckoned with. Night settled fully when they reached the tree line. The moon cast pale silver onto the leaves, and every rustle seemed amplified. The warriors moved silently, guiding Isadora through the underbrush. She followed, her breath slow, controlled, as if she were folding herself into the land itself. Each footfall was intentional, each heartbeat measured. Her mind replayed the events that had led her here, the stones over her head, the crack of bones, the joy of sudden reprieve. She marveled at how grief and hope could coexist. Driving her forward deep in the woods, they paused beside a cold fireplace where others had sat days before. Tosawi knelt and cleared ash to reveal charred bones. He muttered something in Comanche, could not translate, but she felt its gravity. She knelt beside him and traced the outline of the fire pit with her finger. Memories of her own fire, her family gathered around. Laughter mingled with smoke felt distant now, fragile as ember. She allowed herself a single tear. Tosawi laid a hand on her shoulder, firm and unwavering, and she drew strength from it. They rode again, emerging onto a worn trail leading to a cluster of cabins lit by lanterns. Isadora recognized them from her childhood stories. The settlement where her mother had once traded flour for fabric. Now the posts were plastered with wanted notices bearing her likeness. A gaunt woman, wild-eyed, accused of murder and witchcraft. Her own face stared back at her, a stranger's mask. She turned to Tosawi, voice barely audible. "They want me dead." He drew his bow and notched an arrow. She watched as he raised the string, the arrowhead catching moonlight. He aimed at a lantern and released. The glass shattered, flame extinguished. Darkness swallowed the settlement. In that instant, Isadora felt the power of choice settle in her veins. The choice to fight, to protect, to claim her fate. As they advanced, the first shouts rang out, alarm and confusion. Torches flared, men grabbed rifles. From the trees, the Comanche emerged like wraiths, arrows raining down, tomahawks gleaming in flickering light. Isadora moved with them, sliding into a position beside Tosawi. She shouldered the musket, aimed at a figure stumbling with torch in hand. The shot cracked like thunder. The man dropped, and she felt no triumph, only the cold clarity that blood had been shed, and there was no turning back. She pressed onward, every step driven by purpose. The cabins were small hills of darkness punctuated by frantic silhouettes. She passed them, each encounter a test of her resolve. She saw her brother-in-law Gideon's hat snagged on a fence post, his leg bleeding where an arrow had grazed him earlier. But he lived, and so did her son, somewhere beyond this night. She would find him. At the edge of the settlement she halted. Before her stood the largest cabin, its windows dark, door barred. This was the preacher's house, the place where she'd last heard her son's cries. She raised her voice, steady and clear. "David." The name hung in the air like a summons. Inside, the door creaked. A child's wail answered, and her heart thundered in response. She stepped forward, raising both hands. "It's me, Mama. Is here." Tosawi and the others formed a protective ring around her as the door opened. A woman, gaunt, anxious, stood there, David trembling in her arms. Isadora sank to her knees, tears spilling freely. She reached for the child, and he wrapped his arms around her neck, his small body trembling. His tears soaked her shoulder as she whispered promises, never again, always safe. The woman watched, her eyes shining with pity and relief. Behind them, noises swelled, the remaining settlers regrouping, a man shrieking that the savages were killing everyone. Tosawi stepped forward, bow drawn. He shot another arrow into the sky, a warning that snapped the night's tension like a whip. The settlers froze. Then, one by one, they lowered their arms. Isadora rose. David clutched to her chest. She looked at the circle of Comanche warriors, their faces unreadable, yet softened by the sight of mother and child reunited. She turned to Tosawi. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. He nodded once, barely perceptible, then melted back into the shadows with his men. She stood there, cradling David, as the moon climbed higher.